Hello friends, and welcome to another episode of the AgriCapitalist Podcast, where we talk about hidden treasures in plain sight. As it is my tradition, I want to thank everyone that has been with us up to this very moment. You have been amazing. I want to say a big thank you to you. May God continue to bless you. May you keep increasing. May you keep prospering in every of your endeavor. Today's episode will be talking about best ways to maximize profitability from long-term crops. Now, if you remember episode 14 where we talked about profitable crops, we mentioned short-term crops that are going to last between 3 to 4 months. Then we mentioned long-term crops that will last between 3 years to as far as 15 years, right? You remember. Then we did something special that day. We also talked about mid-term crops. We said mid-term crops are crops in between. So where short-term crop stops is where they start from, and what I mean is this. Where short-term crops stop is where their own maturity starts from to 3 years. Yes, so I don't know if you get. So it's mid-term. Long-term starts from 3 years to 15. Short-term starts from 3 to 4 months. Mid-term starts from 4 months to 3 years. Yes, so today we're talking about the best ways to maximize profitability from long-term crops. Yes, so long-term crops. What are long-term crops? Long-term crops are crops that takes a lot of time. They are usually tree crops. Yeah, so in this case, you'd want to replace the term long-term crops for tree crops. Yeah, because tree crops are actually the crops that would stay that long because of the process it takes for them to grow to the point where they are now fruiting. Yeah, and the advantage of tree crops is that when you plant tree crops, you don't get to plant again, unlike short-term crops, right? So while short-term crops are very good in terms of immediate returns, but you have to keep working, going through the process of planting them again every season to ensure you get the income you want. But long-term crops, on the other hand, you plant long-term crops once, right? You just go to maintain, check for weeds, check for the growth per stages, right? Based on your plan. Then once they've gotten to the point where they've matured, they start generating, they start fruiting, they start producing fruits, right? Then they start generating income for you, for life. Some crops generate for more than 30 years, some beyond, do you understand? So those are long-term crops. Long-term crops, you can replace it for the word tree crops, right? So best ways to maximize long-term crops. I've talked about the fact that they are usually tree crops. They are tree crops actually. Yeah. So now we've talked about the part where the profitability comes because of the fact that you don't get to plant it over and over again as short-term crops. The best ways to maximize such profitability is something you as an agripreneur need to know, right? Because now you know about the short-term crop, you know about the long-term crops, right? You know about they are both advantages and disadvantages, right? So you are not choosing long-term crops over short-term crops as your strategy based on your own approach, right? Now you want to know if there are better ways to go about it. Remember the episode where we talked about finding out what works? Yes, so that is what we'll be doing in this episode. Stay tuned. So now, long-term crops, usually tree crops, they have a spacing. If you remember, if you've been following us, we talked about spacing a lot. We've talked about spacing a lot. Episode 11, where we talked about 7 mistakes farmers make, we talked about poor spacing, right? We talked about it in various episodes. So spacing, tree crops, they have their standard spacing. So usually, tree crops are being planted by 10 foot apart. So you plant one here, then 10 foot apart you plant the other one because they are tree crops, right? They need space for them to bring out their branches and do their leaves, right? However, here's where the profitability can start. The profitability in going for long-term crops is this. While you are using the the spacing, the ideal spacing, you integrate via the intercropping method where we talked about the other day, profitable farming practice. You remember we talked about solo farming, intercropping, multi-layer farming, and the rest. You intercrop that tree crop with a short-term crop. In essence, what you are going to do is, from that same piece of land, you are going to generate returns systematically. What I mean is this: the long-term crops are going to take their time, right? But you don't have to be stranded, right? You could still be making your own returns pending when they've grown to the point where they start generating income for you, right? Things needs to happen, right? So for that to happen, you could plant short-term crops in between. You could even do it in such a way that you could transplant such tree crops when necessary. So what you do is, when it is time for land prep, we'll talk about land prep on a single episode where we'll explain everything in details for land prep. When you're about to do your land prep, what you should do is nurse your tree crops first. Then they don't require that much spacing. They're just seeds, or they're seeds. Let's assume you are going for seeds other than seedlings. So while you are nursing, they are going to take a lot of time before they start growing to the point where they're now flowering, they are now big, yeah? Then you can as well just section a part of the land. I talked about farm layouting. Section a part of the land for such nursing the tree crops. Let them stay there. Treat them well, let them grow. The same way they will grow in a spacing of 10 foot apart is the same way they will grow when they are together. Not so together, or spacing at least. Together. Let's say 25 centimeters or thereabout spacing in rows. Let them do their thing there. So what I'm saying in essence is this: 10 foot apart, you calculate your land, right? How many foot, the square foot is your land, right? Divide by 10 foot apart, 10 times 10, that is 100 foot. 100 foot divided by your own square foot, right? You know the number of tree crops that will be in that land. So you don't get more tree crops in a small land. So once you've gotten the desired quantity of tree crops, seeds, you plant them on a section, and then they do their thing while you are using the land for short-term crops. Pending when they grow to the point where you can now transplant them on the spacing of the 10 foot apart. You don't have to go too big for you to now be carrying it in your head, but at least they must have grown to an extent before you start transplanting them in the hole for the 10 foot apart. Then you must have made your profit to an extent from the short-term crops. And once you've transplanted them, here's what you should do. The space in between, you can also intercrop. So I've given two ideas. While you are waiting for the tree crops to do their thing, to grow to the point where they are now seedlings, where they are now tall, before you start transplanting them, you could set a portion of the land for just that and plant on the land short-term crops that can be generating you income in the meantime, right? At the same time, once they've grown to the point where you cannot transplant them, understand that the spacing is 10 foot apart. 10 foot apart is quite a large space, so you could plant in between, in rows. You could plant in between. So that way, while you are still growing, you are planting in between. You are still generating income. Even if they've grown to the point where they are now big, you could still plant in between. But then you look for crops that doesn't require much sunlight, like veggies. You understand? So while the land is for long-term crops, short-term crops will still habitate that land and still provide you income in the long run. So that is it for today's episode. I hope you find value. If you have questions to ask, please drop on the comment section. If you are new, please like and subscribe. Until next time, stay blessed.